My name is Dr. Mark Mitchell, and I've spent the last 15 years of my career examining photographs that don't make sense. As a digital forensics specialist working with historical archives, I've seen my fair share of anomalies. Doctored images from the Civil War era, time period inconsistencies in supposedly authentic portraits, and cleverly staged hoaxes designed to fool collectors and historians alike. But nothing in my extensive experience prepared me for what landed on my desk last Tuesday morning. The photograph arrived in a manila envelope postmarked from a small estate sale company in rural Vermont. No return address, no accompanying letter, just a single black and white photograph wrapped in tissue paper. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical family portrait from the early 1940s. A young mother holding her infant child, both dressed in period-appropriate clothing, standing beside what looked like a modest family home with a white picket fence in the background. But as I examined the image more closely under my magnifying glass, something caught my attention that made my blood run cold. There, clutched in the baby's tiny hand, was an object that shouldn't exist. An object that wouldn't be invented for another 70 years. I've built my career on skepticism, on finding rational explanations for seemingly impossible photographs. Every mysterious image has a story behind it, usually involving clever darkroom techniques, double exposures, or simple misidentification of common objects. That's what I told myself as I stared at this photograph, trying to convince my analytical mind that what I was seeing had a perfectly logical explanation. The baby appeared to be no more than 6 months old, dressed in a white christening gown typical of the 1940s. The mother wore a floral print dress with the characteristic silhouette of that era, her hair styled in victory rolls that were popular during World War II. Everything about the composition screamed authenticity, from the subtle grain of the film to the natural lighting that suggested it was taken outdoors on a partly cloudy day. But that object in the baby's hand refused to be explained away. I spent the first hour running every test I could think of. I scanned the photograph at the highest resolution possible, examining each pixel for signs of digital manipulation. I checked for inconsistencies in the lighting, shadows that didn't align properly, or telltale signs of composite imagery. I analyzed the paper stock, the chemical composition of the photographic emulsion, even the aging patterns along the edges of the print. Everything pointed to one conclusion that I desperately didn't want to accept. This was an authentic photograph from 1942, completely unaltered, showing exactly what it appeared to show. The object measured roughly 3 inches by 2 inches, with rounded corners and what appeared to be a dark, reflective surface. But most disturbing of all, seemed to be a faint glow emanating from one corner of the device, as if a small light was illuminated on its surface. I immediately reached out to my colleague, Dr. James Harrison, who specializes in technology history at the Smithsonian Institution. If anyone could provide a rational explanation for what I was seeing, it would be him. When I sent him a high-resolution scan of the photograph, his response came back within minutes. "Sarah, this is impossible. What you're showing me looks exactly like a modern smartphone, right down to what appears to be a camera lens on the back and a home button on the front. But you're telling me this photograph is from 1942. That's 7 decades before the first iPhone was even conceived." James agreed to meet me the following day to examine the original photograph in person. His expertise in early electronics and communication devices would be crucial in determining whether there was any possible explanation for what we were seeing. The next morning, James arrived at my lab carrying a briefcase full of reference materials and measuring equipment. He's a methodical man, someone who approaches every mystery with the same systematic precision that had made him one of the most respected technology historians in the country. He began by examining the photograph under various types of lighting, noting the way shadows fell across the mysterious object and how it interacted with the surrounding elements of the composition. Using a high-powered microscope, he studied the surface texture of the device, looking for any clues about its construction or materials. "The proportions are exactly right," he murmured, adjusting the focus on his equipment. "The aspect ratio, the thickness, even what appears to be a speaker grill at the top. If I didn't know better, I'd say this baby is holding an iPhone 4, which wasn't released until 2010. But it wasn't just the overall shape that was troubling. As we examined the device more closely, we could make out additional details that made our theory even more unsettling. What appeared to be a circular button at the bottom of the device, positioned exactly where you'd expect to find a home button. A small circular lens on what would be the back of the device, consistent with a rear-facing camera. Most disturbing of all, that faint glow we'd noticed seemed to be coming from the screen itself, as if the device was actually turned on. "This is scientifically impossible," James said, leaning back from the microscope. "The transistor wasn't even invented until 1947, 5 years after this photograph was supposedly taken. The integrated circuit wouldn't come along until the 1950s. The technology required to create anything resembling a smartphone wouldn't exist for decades." We spent the rest of the day running additional tests, each one confirming what we already knew but didn't want to believe. Carbon dating of the paper placed it firmly in the 1940s. Chemical analysis of the photographic emulsion matched the silver halide processes used during that era. Even the mounting adhesive of the photograph on the back was consistent with materials available in 1942. By evening, we had exhausted every scientific test at our disposal. The photograph was authentic, unaltered, and showed exactly what it appeared to show. A baby in 1942 holding what looked for all the world like a modern smartphone. James suggested we reach out to Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a physicist at MIT who specializes in temporal mechanics and theoretical physics. If anyone could provide insight into how such an object might have found its way into a 1940s photograph, it would be someone who understood the theoretical possibilities of time travel and temporal displacement. Dr. Chun's initial response was predictably skeptical. "Time travel remains purely theoretical," she explained during our video conference the following day. "While certain aspects of Einstein's relativity do suggest the possibility of temporal manipulation under extreme conditions, we're talking about energies and technologies far beyond anything currently achievable." However, when she saw the high-resolution scans of the photograph, her demeanor changed dramatically. As a scientist, she was trained to follow the evidence wherever it led, even if it challenged her fundamental understanding of physics and causality. "If this photograph is authentic, and your analysis suggests it is, then we're looking at evidence of something that shouldn't be possible according to our current understanding of temporal mechanics," she said, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone trying to reconcile conflicting data. "But science has been wrong before. Perhaps there are aspects of time travel we simply don't understand yet." She agreed to examine the original photograph herself, bringing equipment that could detect trace radiation signatures that might indicate exposure to exotic forms of energy. If the device had somehow traveled through time, it might retain subtle evidence of that journey. The radiation tests proved inconclusive, showing only the expected background levels you'd find in any 70-year-old photograph. But Dr. Chun noticed something else that had escaped our attention. Using spectral analysis equipment, she detected faint electromagnetic signatures embedded in the photographic emulsion itself. These readings are consistent with the electromagnetic emissions produced by modern electronic devices, she explained, showing us the data on her laptop screen. It's as if the photograph captured not just the visible light reflecting off the object, but also the electromagnetic field it was generating. This discovery opened up new possibilities for investigation. If the device was indeed electronic in nature, it might have left other traces that we could detect and analyze. Dr. Chun suggested we examine the photograph, using equipment designed to detect residual electromagnetic patterns, technology originally developed for forensic analysis of electronic crimes. The electromagnetic analysis revealed something extraordinary. Embedded in the photographic emulsion, invisible to the naked eye, but detectable through specialized scanning techniques, was a pattern of electromagnetic emissions that matched the signature of a device attempting to connect to a cellular network. "This is unprecedented," Dr. Chun said, studying the readouts with growing excitement. "The device appears to have been actively trying to establish a connection to a network that wouldn't exist for another 60 years. It's as if someone dropped a modern smartphone into 1942 and it was still trying to find a cell tower." But our investigation was about to take an even more unusual turn. As word of our discovery began to circulate within the academic community, we started receiving contact from other researchers who had encountered similar anomalies. Dr. Martin Rodriguez from the University of New Mexico reached out to us about a series of photographs from a 1945 military installation that showed what appeared to be solar panels on the roof of a barracks building. Dr. Angela Foster from Oxford University had been studying a Victorian-era portrait that seemed to show a woman wearing what looked suspiciously like wireless earbuds. Each case involved photographic evidence that appeared authentic, but showed technology that shouldn't have existed at the time. "We're dealing with something much larger than a single anomalous photograph," James realized as we compiled reports from researchers around the world. "This appears to be part of a pattern, objects from our modern era appearing in historical photographs spanning more than a century." The implications were staggering. If these photographs were authentic, and our analysis strongly suggested they were, then we were looking at evidence of temporal displacement on a scale that challenged our fundamental understanding of causality and the nature of time itself. But as we delved deeper into the mystery, we began to notice something else. Something that would prove even more disturbing than the original discovery. The baby in the photograph, the one holding the impossible device, wasn't just any random child from 1942. According to records we obtained from the estate sale company, the photograph had belonged to the family of Robert Mitchell, my own grandfather, who had died 6 months earlier. The baby in the photograph wasn't just holding a device that shouldn't exist. The baby was me. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, leaving me staring at my own infant face captured in impossible circumstances 7 decades before my birth. My hands trembled as I held the photograph, searching for any detail that might contradict what I was seeing. But the resemblance was undeniable. The shape of the eyes, the distinctive birthmark on the left temple that I'd carried my entire life, even the way my tiny fingers were positioned around the mysterious device. "This has to be some kind of elaborate hoax," I whispered, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. Every scientific test we'd conducted had confirmed the photograph's authenticity. There was no evidence of tampering, no signs of digital manipulation, nothing to suggest this was anything other than a genuine 1942 family portrait. Dr. Chun leaned forward, her expression grave. "Sarah, have you considered the possibility that what we're looking at isn't time travel in the traditional sense? What if this represents something far more complex? A temporal loop, perhaps, or evidence of parallel timelines intersecting?" Her words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the laboratory. The scientific part of my mind wanted to reject such possibilities as pure science fiction, but the evidence was staring me in the face. My infant self, holding a device that wouldn't be invented until I was already an adult, in a photograph taken decades before my parents were even born. James had been unusually quiet during this exchange, but now he cleared his throat and spoke with the careful precision I'd come to associate with his most important observations. "There's something else we need to consider. If this photograph shows Sarah as an infant in 1942, then someone had to take care of her. Someone had to explain how a baby appeared out of nowhere, with no record of birth, no family history, nothing to account for her existence." The implications of his statement hung in the air between us. If the photograph was real, if I had somehow existed in 1942, then there had to be records, documentation, some trace of my presence in that time period. We needed to investigate further, to find out what had happened to the infant in the photograph, and how she had ended up living a completely different life in a different era. Our first step was to contact the estate sale company that had sent me the photograph. The woman who answered the phone, Margaret Henley, had been handling the Mitchell estate personally. When I explained who I was and why I was calling, her voice took on an odd quality that I couldn't quite identify. "Mr. Mitchell spoke about you often in his final months," she said slowly. "He kept saying his granddaughter would come looking for the truth eventually. He seemed to think it was very important that certain items reach you after his death." "What do you mean he spoke about me often?" I asked, feeling a growing sense of unease. I never met Robert Mitchell. I didn't even know he was my grandfather until you sent me this photograph. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Margaret spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Dr. Mitchell, your grandfather left very specific instructions about that photograph. He said you would know what it meant when you saw it. He also left something else for you, something he said you would need when the time came." She arranged to meet us the following day at the storage facility where the remainder of the Mitchell estate was being held. According to Margaret, Robert Mitchell had been a reclusive man who had spent his final years obsessively documenting what he called temporal anomalies. His house had been filled with photographs, newspaper clippings, scientific journals, and research notes spanning several decades. The storage facility was located in a small town about 2 hours north of my laboratory. As we drove through the rural Vermont countryside, I found myself wondering what other secrets my grandfather had been keeping. Why had he never tried to contact me during his lifetime? What did he know about the photograph that I didn't? The storage unit was larger than I had expected, filled with boxes of documents and several pieces of scientific equipment that looked decades ahead of their supposed manufacture dates. Margaret led us to a specific section where several items had been set aside with my name on them. "Your grandfather was very particular about this," she explained, handing me a sealed envelope with my name written in careful script. "He said you weren't to open this until after you'd seen the photograph and understood what it meant." Inside the envelope was a letter written in the same careful handwriting, along with what appeared to be a laboratory notebook filled with detailed observations and measurements. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before Robert Mitchell's death. "My dear Sarah," it began, "if you are reading this, then the photograph has found its way to you as I intended. You must be confused and frightened by what you've discovered. I understand that feeling better than you can imagine, because I've been living with the truth for over 70 years. The letter went on to explain that Robert Mitchell had been a young photographer in 1942, when he'd encountered something that would change his life forever. According to his account, he'd been documenting daily life in his small Vermont town when he'd witnessed what he described as a temporal displacement event. "I saw the light first," his letter continued, "a brilliant flash that seemed to tear a hole in the very air itself. When my vision cleared, there was a woman standing in my garden, holding an infant child. She was dressed strangely, in clothing I'd never seen before, and she carried with her objects that defied explanation. She spoke urgently about finding someone who could care for the child, someone who would understand the importance of preserving the evidence of what had occurred." The woman, according to Robert's account, had identified herself only as someone from a different time who needed to ensure the child's safety. She'd given him the mysterious device along with specific instructions about how to document its existence without revealing too much to the authorities. She told me the child would grow up to become someone important. The letter explained, someone who would need to understand the truth about temporal displacement when the time came. She said the child would become a scientist, someone with the skills and knowledge necessary to investigate these phenomena properly. Reading these words, I felt a strange mixture of disbelief and recognition. Everything in the letter aligned perfectly with the career path I'd chosen, the specialization that had led me to become one of the few people qualified to analyze the very photograph I'd been sent. But the letter contained one more revelation that would fundamentally change my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my own life. According to Robert Mitchell, The woman who had brought the infant to him in 1942 had looked exactly like me. "She was you, Sarah," the letter stated with absolute certainty. "Older than you are now, perhaps by 10 or 15 years, but unmistakably you." She knew things about the future that proved she was telling the truth about when she came from. She described technologies that wouldn't be invented for decades, mentioned events that hadn't happened yet, but which all came to pass exactly as she predicted. The notebook that accompanied the letter contained detailed records of every prediction the woman had made, along with verification that each one had occurred precisely as foretold. The development of transistors, the space program, the invention of personal computers, the rise of the internet, the creation of smartphones. Every major technological advancement of the past 70 years had been documented in advance by someone who claimed to be me. Dr. Chun studied the notebook with growing amazement. "This is extraordinary documentation," she said, flipping through pages of meticulous observations. "If these predictions were truly made in 1942, then we're looking at evidence of knowledge that could only have come from someone with direct experience of future events." James was examining some of the scientific equipment that had been stored alongside the documents. Much of it appeared to be standard laboratory gear from the 1940s and 50s, but several pieces were clearly far more advanced than anything that should have existed during that time period. "Sarah, look at this," he called, pointing to a device that resembled a modern particle detector. "This equipment is decades ahead of its supposed manufacture date. It's as if someone brought that technology from our time and left it here as evidence." The more we investigated, the clearer it became that Robert Mitchell had been involved in something far more complex than a simple photographic anomaly. His records documented dozens of temporal displacement events over the course of several decades, each one carefully observed and cataloged with scientific precision. According to his notes, the events had become more frequent in recent years, suggesting that whatever was causing them was intensifying. He documented appearances of people and objects from various time periods, always in remote locations where they could be observed without attracting too much attention from authorities. "It's as if someone has been conducting experiments," Dr. Chun observed, studying a timeline Robert had constructed showing the frequency and intensity of the events. "The pattern suggests deliberate testing of temporal displacement technology, with increasing sophistication over time." But the most disturbing discovery came when we found Robert's final entries, written just days before his death. According to these notes, he'd received a visit from the same woman, who had brought the infant to him in 1942. She'd aged appropriately for the passage of time, appearing to be in her 50s, and she'd come to retrieve something she'd left with him decades earlier. "She took the child," his final entry stated, "along with all the evidence I'd preserved of the temporal displacement events. She said it was time for the next phase of the experiment to begin. She promised that Sarah would understand everything when she was ready, when she had developed the skills and knowledge necessary to investigate these phenomena on her own." The implications were staggering. If Robert's account was accurate, then my entire life had been orchestrated by someone who claimed to be a future version of myself. Every choice I'd made, every career decision, every specialized skill I'd developed, had been part of a larger plan designed to bring me to this moment of discovery. But there was something else in Robert's final notes that made me question everything I thought I understood about causality and free will. Hidden among his last entries was a detailed schematic of a device he called a temporal stabilizer, along with instructions for its construction using materials and technologies that were only recently becoming available. The schematic was incredibly detailed, showing circuit diagrams that incorporated quantum processors and exotic matter containment, systems that represented the cutting edge of theoretical physics. What made it even more remarkable was that it had been drawn in 1942, using pencil and paper, by a man who had no formal training in advanced physics or engineering. "These diagrams are beyond anything I've seen in current research," Dr. Chun said, her voice filled with awe as she studied the technical specifications. The theoretical framework alone would require knowledge of quantum mechanics that wasn't fully developed until the 1970s. Yet here it is, drawn 70 years ago, with mathematical precision that suggests deep understanding of principles we're only beginning to grasp today. James had been comparing the schematic to modern electronic components, noting similarities that seemed impossible given the time period of their creation. "Look at this section here," he said, pointing to a complex circuit design. "This appears to show a quantum entanglement generator paired with what looks like a temporal field manipulator. The engineering is sophisticated beyond anything we currently possess." As we continued examining the documents, a pattern began to emerge that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Robert Mitchell hadn't just been a passive observer of temporal displacement events. According to his notes, he'd been actively involved in constructing devices and conducting experiments based on information provided by his mysterious visitor. The notebook detailed construction of several prototype devices over the course of decades, each one more sophisticated than the last. Early entries described simple electromagnetic field generators that produced minor temporal distortions. Later entries documented the creation of devices capable of creating stable temporal windows that could observe events across different time periods. "He was building a time machine," I whispered, the reality of what we were discovering finally sinking in. Or at least components of one. Someone was guiding him through the process, feeding him information about technologies that wouldn't be invented for decades. But the most disturbing revelation came when we found blueprints for a device that Robert had labeled simply as Project Sarah. The technical specifications showed a sophisticated apparatus designed for what the notes described as consciousness transfer across temporal boundaries. According to the documentation, the device was intended to allow someone's memories and personality to be transmitted to their past or future self. Dr. Chun studied the blueprints with growing concern. If this technology actually works, it would explain everything we've been observing. The woman who visited Robert in 1942 wouldn't have been time traveling in the traditional sense. She would have been transmitting her consciousness backward through time, effectively becoming her younger self while retaining all her future memories. The implications were staggering. If such technology existed, it would mean that the version of myself who had visited Robert Mitchell wasn't a physical time traveler at all. She was me, transmitting my consciousness back through time to orchestrate the events that had led to my current investigation. James had been unusually quiet during this discussion, but now he spoke up with the careful tone he used when presenting particularly controversial theories. "Sarah, there's something else we need to consider. If this consciousness transfer technology is real, and if you've already used it to communicate with the past, then your future self must know something that requires this elaborate setup to prevent or achieve." His words sent a chill through me that went beyond mere scientific curiosity. If my future self had gone to such extraordinary lengths to manipulate events across multiple decades, there had to be something catastrophically important at stake. Something that required precise timing and careful orchestration to address properly. We found our answer in a sealed section of the storage unit that Margaret had initially overlooked. Inside a climate-controlled container were dozens of photographs documenting temporal displacement events from around the world, each one showing objects or people that clearly didn't belong in their respective time periods. The photographs spanned more than a century, showing everything from Roman soldiers carrying what appeared to be assault rifles to Victorian ladies wearing modern athletic shoes. But what made them particularly disturbing was the increasing frequency of the anomalies as they approached the present day. "Look at the pattern," Dr. Chun said, arranging the photographs chronologically on a table. "The temporal displacement events are accelerating exponentially. Whatever is causing them is building towards something significant in our near future." The final photograph in the collection showed something that made my blood run cold. It was a modern image taken just months ago, according to the timestamp, showing a massive facility that I didn't recognize. The building was enormous, clearly designed for some kind of industrial or scientific purpose, with arrays of satellite dishes and what appeared to be particle accelerator components visible on the roof. But what made the image truly terrifying was the date stamp visible on a digital display in the foreground. According to the timestamp, the photograph had been taken 3 years in the future, in 2027, yet the image quality in digital metadata suggested it had been captured using current technology. Someone is documenting events that haven't happened yet, James observed, his voice barely above a whisper. This isn't just time travel anymore. We're looking at evidence of systematic temporal manipulation on a massive scale. The facility in the photograph was labeled with a corporate logo I didn't recognize, but the accompanying documentation provided disturbing details about its purpose. According to notes written in what I now recognized as my own handwriting, the facility was designed for large-scale temporal displacement experiments. The kind of experiments that could potentially unravel the fabric of causality itself. Dr. Chun studied the technical specifications with growing alarm. If these calculations are correct, the energy levels involved in these experiments would be sufficient to create paradoxes that could destabilize our entire timeline. We're not just talking about isolated temporal anomalies anymore. This could threaten the fundamental structure of reality itself. The documentation included detailed warnings about the consequences of allowing the facility to become operational. According to my future self's notes, the experiments conducted there would create cascading temporal disruptions that would eventually make stable causality impossible. The increasing frequency of displacement events we'd been observing was apparently just the beginning. That's why I sent myself the photograph. I realized, the pieces finally falling into place. My future self isn't trying to create temporal paradoxes. She's trying to prevent them. Everything that's happened, from Robert Mitchell's involvement to my specialized career, has been designed to put me in position to stop something catastrophic from occurring. But preventing a future catastrophe would require more than just knowledge of what was coming. According to the documentation, stopping the facility would require precise timing and access to technologies that didn't yet exist. Technologies that would need to be developed using information transmitted backward through time from someone who had already witnessed the consequences of inaction. James examined the technical requirements with the methodical precision that had made him invaluable to our investigation. The good news is that most of these components could theoretically be constructed using current technology, if we knew exactly what we were building and why. The bad news is that we're talking about resources and expertise far beyond what any individual researcher could assemble. Dr. Chun nodded grimly. We would need support from major institutions, government backing, and cooperation from scientists around the world. The kind of coordinated effort that would require convincing people of something they would naturally dismiss as science fiction. That's when I realized the true genius of my future self's plan. By creating a trail of evidence spanning multiple decades, by involving respected researchers like Robert Mitchell, by ensuring that the investigation would be conducted according to rigged credibility for revelations that would otherwise risk scientific standards, she had been building the impossible to accept. The photograph of me as an infant holding a smartphone wasn't just evidence of temporal displacement. It was the first piece of a carefully constructed puzzle, designed to convince the scientific community that time travel was not only possible, but actively being used to manipulate historical events. But as we prepared to leave the storage facility with our incredible discoveries, Margaret approached us with one final revelation that would change everything we thought we understood about the situation. "There's something else your grandfather wanted you to know," she said, her voice carrying an odd mixture of reluctance and urgency. "He said to tell you that the woman who visited him, the one who brought the baby, she wasn't alone. There was someone else with her, someone she seemed to be afraid of." According to Margaret, Robert's final conversations had revealed details about the temporal displacement events that he had been too frightened to document in his official notes. The woman who claimed to be my future self had apparently been fleeing from someone or something that was pursuing her across time. He said she kept looking over her shoulder, as if she expected to be followed, Margaret continued. And just before she left with the child, she warned him that others would come looking for information about the displacement events. She told him to hide the evidence and never speak of it until you came looking for answers. The revelation added a new dimension of urgency to our investigation. If my future self had been fleeing from someone, it suggested that the temporal manipulation we'd discovered wasn't the work of a single individual. There were apparently others involved, others with their own agendas and access to the same technology. As we drove back toward my laboratory, our car loaded with boxes of evidence that challenged everything we thought we knew about time and causality, I found myself wondering what other surprises awaited us. The photograph that had started this investigation was beginning to look like just the tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper into the mysteries of temporal manipulation than any of us had imagined. The questions multiplied with each new discovery. Who was pursuing my future self across time? What was their agenda? And most importantly, how much time did we have before the catastrophic events she was trying to prevent would begin to unfold? The answers to those questions came sooner than I expected, and from a source I never could have anticipated. 3 days after our return from Vermont, I received a call from someone claiming to be Dr. Robert Steinberg, a theoretical physicist from a private research institute in Switzerland. His voice carried an accent I couldn't quite place, and there was something about his manner of speaking that immediately put me on edge. "Dr. Mitchell, I understand you've been investigating certain photographic anomalies," he said, his words carefully measured. "I represent an organization that has been tracking similar phenomena for quite some time. We would very much like to discuss your findings with you." I asked him how he had learned about our research, since we had been extremely careful to keep our discoveries confidential while we worked to understand their implications. His response was both evasive and deeply unsettling. "Information has a way of traveling through time, Dr. Mitchell. Sometimes it arrives before it was ever sent. I think you're beginning to understand how that process works." The conversation left me with a profound sense of unease. Someone else knew about our investigation, someone with apparent knowledge of temporal manipulation, who seemed far more comfortable discussing these concepts than any legitimate scientist should be. I immediately contacted James and Dr. Chun to warn them about the mysterious caller. James was the first to voice what we were all thinking. If there are other people involved in this, people with their own agendas, then we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. Your future self warned Robert Mitchell that others would come looking for information. This Dr. Steinberg might be exactly who she was afraid of. Dr. Chun suggested we continue our investigation while implementing additional security measures. We need to document everything we've discovered and ensure that copies of our findings are stored in multiple secure locations. If someone is trying to suppress this information or use it for their own purposes, we need to make sure it remains available to other researchers. Over the following days, we worked systematically through the remaining materials from Robert Mitchell's estate. Each box revealed new layers of complexity to the temporal manipulation events we'd been studying. Hidden among seemingly routine correspondence were coded messages that appeared to contain instructions for constructing additional components of the temporal stabilization technology. One particularly intriguing discovery was a series of photographs that Robert had taken using specialized equipment designed to capture electromagnetic signatures invisible to conventional cameras. The images showed temporal displacement events in progress, revealing the distinctive energy patterns that accompanied the arrival or departure of objects from different time periods. "Look at these readings," Dr. Chun said, studying the electromagnetic data embedded in the photographs. "The energy signatures are consistent with what we'd expect from controlled temporal manipulation, not random anomalies. Someone has been using sophisticated technology to deliberately create these displacement events." The controlled nature of the events suggested a level of organization and resources that went far beyond what any individual researcher could assemble. We were dealing with what appeared to be a coordinated effort involving multiple people across different time periods, all working towards some common objective. But the most disturbing discovery came when we found evidence that the temporal manipulation events weren't limited to objects and people from the future appearing in the past. Robert's records documented instances of individuals from our current time period disappearing without explanation, only to appear in historical photographs taken decades or even centuries earlier. It's a two-way process, I realized, studying a photograph from the 1800s that clearly showed a man wearing modern clothing standing in the background of what should have been a purely historical scene. People aren't just sending things backward through time. They're physically traveling to different eras and remaining there. James examined the historical records associated with the photograph, finding documentation that the mysterious figure had appeared in the small town depicted in the image and had lived there for several years before disappearing as suddenly as he had arrived. Local records described him as a strange man who possessed unusual knowledge of future events and technologies that wouldn't be invented for generations. The question is whether these people are traveling voluntarily or if they're being sent against their will. Dr. Chun observed, if someone has developed the ability to forcibly displace people through time, the implications for personal freedom and security are terrifying. Our investigation was interrupted by another phone call from Dr. Steinberg, this time with a more direct message. Dr. Mitchell, I think it's time we met in person. There are aspects of your research that you don't fully understand, aspects that could be dangerous if pursued without proper guidance. When I pressed him for more specific information about what he knew and who he represented, his response sent chills through me. I represent the same organization that your future self has been trying to evade. We've been monitoring her activities across multiple timelines, and we're very interested in preventing her from achieving her objectives. The admission confirmed my worst fears. The mysterious Dr. Steinberg wasn't just another researcher interested in temporal anomalies. He was actively working against the version of myself who had orchestrated the entire chain of events that led to my current investigation. Whatever my future self was trying to prevent, there were others who wanted to ensure it happened. Why are you telling me this? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the implications of what I was hearing. Because you're going to help us stop her, he replied with disturbing confidence. Whether you realize it or not, Dr. Mitchell, you're already part of our operation. Every discovery you've made, every piece of evidence you've uncovered, has been guided by information we've been feeding you through carefully orchestrated temporal manipulation. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. If Dr. Steinberg was telling the truth, then my entire investigation had been manipulated from the beginning. The photograph that started everything, the discoveries in Robert Mitchell's estate, even the connections I'd made with James and Dr. Chun, might all have been part of an elaborate setup designed to use me as an unwitting agent in someone else's temporal war. But even as I grappled with the possibility that I'd been manipulated, I realized there was something that didn't add up in Dr. Steinberg's account. If his organization had been guiding my investigation from the beginning, why would they have allowed me to discover evidence that revealed their involvement? Why risk exposing their manipulation when they could have simply continued operating in secret? The answer came to me with startling clarity. They hadn't intended for me to discover their involvement. Something had gone wrong with their plan, something that had forced them to reveal themselves prematurely. My future self's carefully orchestrated chain of events had somehow disrupted their timeline manipulation in ways they hadn't anticipated. I decided to play along with Dr. Steinberg's demands, while secretly continuing my investigation with James and Dr. Chun. If there truly was a temporal war being fought across multiple time periods, I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before deciding which side represented the greater threat to reality itself. What exactly do you want me to do? I asked Dr. Steinberg, hoping to gain more information about his organization's objectives. "We want you to construct the temporal stabilization device described in your grandfather's notes," he replied, "but with certain modifications that will allow us to control its operation. Instead of preventing temporal displacement events, we want to use the technology to expand our ability to manipulate historical events on a much larger scale." The request confirmed my suspicions about the true nature of the conflict. My future self wasn't trying to destabilize reality through temporal manipulation. She was trying to prevent others from using time travel technology to rewrite history according to their own agenda. The increasing frequency of displacement events we'd been observing wasn't the result of her activities, but rather evidence of an escalating temporal war between competing factions. "How do I know you're telling me the truth about any of this?" I challenged, hoping to provoke him into revealing more information about his organization's capabilities and objectives. His response was both a demonstration of power and a threat that left no doubt about the seriousness of the situation. "Check tomorrow's newspaper, Dr. Mitchell. Page 3, second column. There will be an article about a fire at a research facility in Colorado. The fire will occur at precisely 3:47 p.m., destroying the equipment worth over $2 million. No one will be injured, but the facility will be completely unusable for several months." The next day, I found exactly the article he had described, published with details that matched his prediction perfectly. But what made it truly disturbing was the timestamp on the newspaper's digital version, which showed it had been published several hours before the fire actually occurred. Somehow, Dr. Steinberg's organization had arranged for news of an event to be reported before it happened. The demonstration left no doubt that we were dealing with individuals who possessed sophisticated, temporal manipulation capabilities and weren't hesitant to use them to achieve their objectives. If they could orchestrate events with such precision, they could potentially rewrite any aspect of history they chose to modify. Standing here today, 3 months after that first photograph arrived on my desk, I'm left with more questions than answers. The temporal war continues around us, invisible to most, fought by factions we barely understand for stakes we can only imagine. My future self remains elusive, her warnings echoing through decades of carefully planted evidence, while Dr. Steinberg's organization grows bolder in their attempts to reshape history itself. Perhaps that's the most unsettling truth of all, that reality isn't as fixed as we believed, and somewhere in the shadows, others are deciding what our past should have been.